Imagine this. It's a Tuesday morning. You make your child's lunch. You brush their hair. You tie their shoes. You kiss them on the forehead and watch them climb onto a school bus, laughing, waving, maybe a little too excited to be going on a field trip instead of sitting through math class. You wave back. You go inside. You make yourself a cup of coffee. And you never see them again. Not that afternoon. Not that evening. Not the next day, or the next week, or the next year. Not for 21 years. Every single child on that bus, 23 of them, vanished without a trace. Together. All at once. On a route that everyone knew. In broad daylight. No bodies were ever found at the scene. No witnesses came forward. No ransom notes appeared. No phone calls were made. No one saw anything, heard anything, or reported anything suspicious. Just an empty bus parked on the side of a road. Engines still warm. Backpacks still on the seats. Lunchboxes half open. A juice box still rolling slowly down the aisle. 23 children. Gone. And in the days and weeks that followed, every investigator, every forensic specialist, every behavioral expert who looked at this case said the same thing. Privately, of course, because they would never say it out loud to the parents waiting by the phone. They said, "We don't understand this. None of this makes sense." But one mother, a quiet woman named Elena Vasquez, noticed something on that first morning that no one else did. Something small. Something that, at the time, seemed completely insignificant. Something she tucked into the back of her mind without even fully understanding why. It would take her 21 years to understand what it meant. And when she finally did, when she finally pieced together what had really happened to those children, the truth was more disturbing than any of the theories anyone had ever considered. This is the story of an entire classroom that vanished, and the one mother who never stopped looking. The town of Callaway Creek, nestled in the hill country of Central Texas, was the kind of place where people still left their back doors unlocked. Population just under 4,000. One main street with a hardware store, a diner, a barbershop that had been owned by the same family for 3 generations. A town where everyone knew your name, your parents' names, and probably what you'd had for dinner the night before. It wasn't a wealthy town, but it was a safe one. The kind of place where parents let their kids ride their bikes until the streetlights came on. Where teachers stayed late without being asked. Where the school, Callaway Creek Elementary, was the center of community life. The place where every fall festival and Christmas play and graduation ceremony gave the whole town a reason to come together. Room 14 was the 5th grade class of Mrs. Patricia Okafor. 23 students, 10 and 11 years old. Most of them having grown up together since kindergarten. They were a tight group. Funny. A little rowdy. The kind of class that kept a teacher on her toes but also made her genuinely sad when June came and she had to let them go. Patricia Okafor had been teaching for 16 years by that point. She was patient, attentive, deeply caring. The kind of teacher whose former students still came back to visit years later. Her classroom walls were covered in student artwork, hand-painted planets, and a running word of the week board that the kids took turns updating. She knew each of her students deeply, their learning styles, their fears, which ones needed encouragement, and which ones needed to be quietly slowed down. On the morning of October 14, 2003, Room 14 was scheduled for a field trip to the Hartwell Nature and Science Reserve, a sprawling outdoor education center about 40 minutes outside of town. The trip had been planned for weeks. Permission slips had been signed. Lunches had been packed. There was even a permission slip from the reserve itself on file with the school office, countersigned by the vice principal, David Crane. The bus left at 8:40 in the morning. The driver was a man named Roy Hendricks, 63 years old, 22 years of experience driving school routes in Callaway Creek. Reliable. Quiet. Nobody's idea of a suspicious character. He waved to the school secretary as the bus pulled out of the parking lot, the way he always did. Parents had been told to pick up their children at 3:15 in the afternoon, right at the school drop-off loop. By 3:30, no bus had arrived. At first, almost no one wore it. Buses run late. Traffic happens. There's always a bathroom stop. Parents stood in the parking lot and checked their phones and talked about the weather. By 4 o'clock, the school secretary, Linda Dumas, called the reserve's main office. No one answered. She tried again at 4:15. Still no answer. By 4:30, the parking lot at Callaway Creek Elementary had grown very quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The other kind. The kind that lives in the space between the last thing you expected and the first moment you realize something is terribly wrong. By 5 o'clock in the evening, the Callaway Creek Police Department received the first call. And by nightfall, they realized this was not a delay. This was a disappearance. Within 2 hours of that first call, every available officer in the county was mobilized. By 10 o'clock that night, the Texas Department of Public Safety had been contacted. By midnight, there were helicopters in the air with searchlights sweeping the hill country terrain between Callaway Creek and the Hartwell Reserve. They found the bus at 1:17 in the morning. It was parked on a gravel pull-off on County Road 7, a narrow stretch of road that ran between two low hills, surrounded by scrub oak and cedar. The engine was off. The headlights were off. The door was closed. When the first officer approached and pulled that door open, what he saw stopped him cold. Every single backpack was still in its place, hanging from the seat backs or tucked under the benches. Some of the kids had left their lunches on their seats. A small purple water bottle had rolled into the aisle. Mrs. Okafor's brown leather bag was sitting right behind the driver's seat. Wallet inside, phone inside, everything inside. Roy Hendrick's jacket was still hanging from the driver's seat. But there was no Roy Hendricks. No Mrs. Okafor. No 23 children. No one. The forensic team arrived within the hour. They went over that bus with extraordinary thoroughness, dusting every surface, lifting every fiber, cataloging every item. Nothing had been disturbed. There were no signs of struggle. The seats were in order. Not a single window was broken. The emergency exit at the back of the bus was closed and locked from the inside, which forensic examiners noted was unusual but not impossible. What they didn't find was almost more alarming than anything they did find. No footprints. The gravel around the bus had been examined carefully. There were tire tracks where the bus had pulled off the road. There were faint impressions that could have been shoe prints near the door, but the surrounding area showed nothing conclusive. No mass movement of feet across the gravel. No path leading into the cedar brush. No broken branches. No displaced soil on the hillsides. 24 people had exited, or been removed from, that bus, and the earth had recorded almost none of it. The search expanded in every direction. The Hartwell Reserve was swept. Every hiking trail, every maintenance road, every building on the property was searched. Neighboring ranches were canvassed. The small cluster of houses about 2 miles down County Road 7 were visited door to door. Nobody had seen anything. Nobody had heard anything unusual. The reserve's main office, when finally reached by phone early the next morning, told investigators something that made the hair stand up on the back of every detective's neck. They had no record of a field trip booking for Room 14 from Callaway Creek Elementary on October 14, 2003. Let that settle for a moment. The permission slips the parents had signed, the trip information that had gone home in their children's backpacks, had directed them to the Hartwell Nature and Science Reserve. But the reserve had no record of the booking. No confirmation email. No calendar entry. No payment. The trip, apparently, had been arranged entirely through the school, through Vice Principal David Crane, who had approved the paperwork and signed the permission form. But when investigators went to pull the original booking documentation from the school's records, it wasn't there. Then investigators started looking more carefully at the timeline, and they realized something chilling. The timeline didn't add up. In the weeks after the disappearance, Callaway Creek became famous in the worst possible way. National news crews set up on the main street. Satellite trucks were parked in the school parking lot. The families of the 23 missing children were photographed from every angle, their grief made public in a way that felt violent in its own right. Politicians made statements. The FBI sent a team. A hotline was set up. Tips poured in from across the country. Dozens were chased down, each one generating a brief flare of hope before collapsing into another dead end. Someone claimed they'd seen a group of children at a rest stop in New Mexico. Another caller said they'd spotted a large group of kids near a rural community outside of Waco. A woman in Louisiana said she was certain she'd recognized one of the children from the news in a grocery store. None of it led anywhere. The FBI team worked the case for 14 months. They interviewed hundreds of people. They traced Roy Hendrick's financial records, his phone records, his relationships. They examined every aspect of Mrs. Okafor's life, her family, her finances, her history. They interviewed David Crane, the vice principal who had approved the trip paperwork multiple times. And at the end of 14 months, they had no suspects in custody, no definitive theory, and no trace of the children. The national media, with its ravenous, relentless appetite for new tragedies, eventually moved on. The satellite trucks disappeared. The cameras went away. The town of Callaway Creek was left to sit with its grief, a grief so large and so formless that it had no edges, no shape, no place to go. Some families moved away. They couldn't bear to drive past the school every morning, couldn't bear to see the empty swing sets, couldn't bear to live in a place where every corner held a memory of someone who was no longer there. Others stayed, and slowly, painfully, guiltily, but inevitably, they began the unbearable process of building a life around the absence. Not over it, around it, the way a tree grows around a wound in its bark. The police department quietly redirected resources. Not because they didn't care. They did, deeply. But the active leads had dried to nothing, and there were other cases, other responsibilities, other communities that needed protection. By 2006, 3 years after the disappearance, the case had been officially reclassified as inactive, which is the institutional language for, we don't know what happened, and we have no way forward. Unofficially, within the department, officers whispered a word they would never say to a family member. Unsolvable. But not everyone accepted that word. Elena Vasquez had been 41 years old when her daughter Mia disappeared on that bus. Mia was 10. She had dark curly hair and a gap-toothed smile, and she'd been obsessed, completely, joyfully obsessed, with drawing animals. Horses especially. The walls of her bedroom were covered in horses she'd drawn herself, and Elena had framed 3 of them and hung them in the living room because she thought they were genuinely beautiful. Mia's bedroom had not changed since October 14, 2003. The horse drawings were still on the walls. Her backpack, the one she hadn't brought on the field trip because it was being repaired, was still hanging on the hook behind her door. Her library book, 2 weeks overdue the day she disappeared, was still on her nightstand. Elena had quietly paid the fines every month for the first year, and then she'd spoken to the head librarian, a woman named Carol Prentice, who had told her with tears running silently down her face that the book would be considered permanently checked out. It would never be due again. Elena kept notes, dates and times and names in a spiral notebook that she carried everywhere. She had 3 of them by 2005, 6 by 2008. She kept a map on the wall of her second bedroom, the one she'd stopped letting guests use, the one she'd slowly converted into something between a memorial and a research station. Photographs, printouts of news articles, red string connecting locations, post-it notes in her precise, neat handwriting, a timeline that stretched from one end of the wall to the other. Her sister, Rosa, worried about her openly. Her brother, Marco, suggested, gently, repeatedly, with great love, that she might benefit from speaking to someone. Her friends from the church she'd attended since childhood watched her with a helpless kind of sadness, unsure whether to encourage her or intervene. Her sister, Rosa, worried about her openly. Her brother, Marco, suggested, gently, repeatedly, with great love, that she might benefit from speaking to someone. Her friends from the church she'd attended since childhood watched her with a helpless kind of sadness, unsure whether to encourage her or intervene. It started with a photograph. In 2007, 4 years after the disappearance, Elena was going through a box of materials she'd requested from the police department under the Freedom of Information Act. Copies of documents, photographs from the initial search, interview transcripts. She'd been through these materials dozens of times by now, reading them the way a scholar reads ancient text, slowly, carefully, looking for something that hadn't revealed itself yet. She was sitting at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a cup of cold coffee and a magnifying glass, going through crime scene photographs from the bus, when she stopped at a particular image. It was a photograph of the interior of the bus, taken from the front, looking toward the back. It showed the neat rows of seats, the backpacks, the lunch bags. Ordinary. She'd seen it many times. But this time, she noticed something she hadn't noticed before. In the fourth row on the left side of the bus, there was a small blue jacket, a child's jacket, folded neatly on the seat. Not left behind carelessly, the way a child leaves a jacket when they are warm and distracted and running out to recess. Folded. Deliberately, carefully folded, the way an adult would fold a jacket before placing it somewhere. Elena stayed at it for a long time. She went through every family's account of what their child had been wearing that day. She cross-referenced them with a list that police had compiled in the first days of the investigation. The blue jacket, she eventually determined, belonged to a boy named Thomas Garland. His mother, Diane Garland, had told investigators he'd been wearing it when he left the house. Elena had met Diane Garland several times over the years at the small gatherings the families occasionally organized, evenings where they came together not to share new information, because there rarely was any, but simply to be in the presence of other people who understood the specific weight of what they carried. Elena called Diane the next morning. "The jacket," she said. "Do you remember if Thomas ever folded his own clothes?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "He was 10, Diane said. He couldn't fold a paper airplane without help." "Why?" Elena told her about the photograph. Diane came over that afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the image through the magnifying glass for a very long time. "Someone folded that," Diane said finally. "Someone who wasn't Thomas." It was a small thing. It could have meant nothing. Elena knew that. But it lodged in her mind like a splinter, too small to remove, too persistent to ignore. She began rereading the witness interview transcripts with fresh eyes, looking for inconsistencies. And she found them. Not dramatic ones. Not obvious lies or glaring contradictions. The kind of inconsistencies that occur when someone is trying very hard to remember something accurately, except that in several cases, the inconsistencies ran in a single direction. They minimized. They omitted. There was a woman named Cheryl Baxter who had been at the school the morning the bus left. She ran the after-school program. She had given a statement to police saying she'd seen the bus leave at approximately 8:40 and that everything had appeared normal. But in her second interview, 6 weeks later, she said she hadn't been at the school that morning. She'd come in late, around 10 o'clock. The detective who had conducted both interviews, a man named Sergeant Phil Dawson, now retired, had noted the discrepancy in his report. But he had accepted Cheryl Baxter's explanation that she confused dates in her first statement, given the traumatic context. Elena thought about that explanation for a very long time. She began mapping the adults connected to the trip, every adult. The teacher, the driver, the vice principal, the after-school program coordinator, the school's secretary. She cross-referenced their stated whereabouts with every piece of information she could find, and she began to see the shape of something she didn't have a name for yet. Something that felt deliberate, constructed. She couldn't prove it. She had no evidence in any legal sense. She had a folded jacket and a woman who couldn't keep her own timeline straight and a feeling in the deepest part of her chest that refused to let go. But then she had a thought that changed everything. What if this class was never meant to return? Once Elena allowed herself to think that thought, really think it, Not as an irrational fear, but as a serious hypothesis. Everything looked different. She started with the paperwork. The field trip to the Hartwell Nature and Science Reserve had been approved by Vice Principal David Crane. He had signed a permission slip that went home to parents. He had, according to his own statement to police, made the booking with the reserve directly by phone and received verbal confirmation. But the reserve had no record of the booking. The police had investigated this. Their conclusion was that there had been some kind of administrative error on the reserve's end, a booking that hadn't been properly recorded, a phone call that hadn't been logged. It was imperfect, but it wasn't impossible, and without evidence of deliberate falsification, they couldn't move further down that road. Elena spent 3 months in 2009 going through the exact sequence of how field trips were typically approved in the Callaway Creek School District. She requested records through the district's administrative office, records of other field trips that year, the year before, 5 years before. She compared processes. She looked at how bookings were documented, what paperwork was filed, how payment was handled. And she found something. Every other field trip in the district's records had a corresponding payment record, a check or purchase order made out to the destination venue, kept on file in the school office. There was no payment record for the Hartwell trip, not a voided check, not a purchase order, not a reimbursement request, not even a note in the school budget ledger for that academic year suggesting that such a payment had been planned. The trip, as far as the financial records were concerned, did not exist. Elena brought this to the attention of a journalist named Carla Whitmore, who had been covering the case since the beginning for the regional paper, the Hill Country Bulletin. Carla was one of the few people who had consistently taken Elena seriously over the years, not because she had any inside knowledge, but because she was a good journalist and she believed that good journalism meant listening to people that everyone else had dismissed. Carla wrote a piece about the financial discrepancy in 2009. It was picked up by a few larger outlets. It generated some attention, some online discussion, a brief and unsatisfying follow-up from the district, which stated that records from that period had been partially lost in a server transition. But it didn't reopen the investigation. And then Elena found David Crane. Or rather, she found the absence of him. David Crane had resigned from Callaway Creek Elementary in January 2004, 3 months after the disappearance. The official reason given was personal reasons, and in the context of the trauma the school community was experiencing, no one had questioned it deeply. He'd been interviewed multiple times by investigators and had been cooperative, or appeared cooperative, and had not been named as a suspect. He had moved, according to the records Elena was able to access, to San Antonio. Then, sometime around 2005 or 2006, based on everything Elena could find, he had simply ceased to generate any publicly traceable presence. No new address registered with the county. No professional licenses renewed. No social media footprint of any kind. No tax record she could access. She hired a private investigator in 2010, spending money she didn't have, money she'd saved carefully over years, to locate David Crane. The investigator came back to her 8 weeks later with a single sheet of paper. David Crane could not be found. He was not listed as deceased in any state's vital records. He had not, as far as anyone could determine, left the country. He had simply, quietly, systematically, disappeared. Elena sat with that piece of paper for a long time. She thought about a man who had signed a permission slip for a trip that left no financial trace. A trip to a destination that had no record of being contacted. A trip from which 23 children never returned. A man who had quietly resigned 3 months later, moved once, and then vanished. She thought about Cheryl Baxter and the morning she couldn't remember. She thought about the jacket, folded neatly on the seat. She thought about her daughter Mia, with her gap-toothed smile and her horses on the walls. And then she made a decision. She was done asking other people to care about this. She was going to find the answer herself, no matter how long it took. Then, 21 years after that bus drove out of the school parking lot, something resurfaced. It began with an email. In March of 2024, Elena received an email from a woman she had never heard of, a woman named Sandra Pollard, who identified herself as a former administrative employee of the Hartwell Nature and Science Reserve. Sandra was 62 years old. She had worked at the reserve from 1998 to 2005, handling bookings, correspondence, and visitor records. She had left in 2005 and had spent the years since living quietly in the hill country, working part-time at a garden center, largely disconnected from the news and the internet. She had recently, for the first time, read Carla Whitmore's 2009 article about the Callaway Creek disappearance, shared by a friend on social media, nearly 15 years after it was published. And she had something to tell Elena. They met in person, at a coffee shop in Fredericksburg, neutral territory, a 2-hour drive for each of them. Elena brought her notebook. Sandra brought a folder. Inside the folder were photocopies of documents Sandra had kept when she left the reserve, documents she'd taken, not out of any conspiracy-related thinking, but because she was a meticulous person who kept copies of everything, a habit formed across decades of administrative work. Among the documents was a printed email exchange dated September 2003, 6 weeks before the disappearance. The email had been sent to the Reserve General Booking address. It was from someone using a personal email account, not a school district account, requesting a booking for October 14, 2003, for a group of approximately 25 children, 5th grade, from Callaway Creek. It included a name, D. Crane. But here was what mattered. The reserve had replied to that email, accepting the booking, confirming the date. And then, approximately 1 week later, the booking had been canceled by the same person, D. Crane, with no explanation given. The reserve had canceled the booking, generated a brief internal note, and moved on. That cancellation had wiped the original booking from their active records, which was why, when police had contacted them on the night of October 14th, they had truthfully reported no record of a booking for that group, because it had been canceled. But it had originally existed, and it had been canceled 1 week before the disappearance. Elena sat across from Sandra Pollard and read those pages 3 times. Her hands were completely steady. Later, she would think about that, how steady her hands were, and understand that it was because she had been waiting for this moment for 21 years. Her whole body knew this was it before her mind had fully caught up. This was the evidence of planning. D. Crane, David Crane, had made a real booking with the real reserve. That booking was a piece of plausible paperwork, something that could be shown to the school office to confirm the trip was legitimate. Then he had canceled it a week before the trip. The children would be taken somewhere else. The reserve would have no record of them arriving. The plan, whatever it was, had relied on that confusion. Elena photographed every page in Sandra's folder and sent them to Carla Whitmore that afternoon. Within 72 hours, Carla had spoken to 2 former FBI agents who specialized in child abduction cases. Both agreed that the documents, combined with Elena's years of compiled research, represented a compelling basis for a federal reopening of the investigation. Within 2 weeks, the story had gone national. Not in the exploitative, circus-like way of the early days, but in the careful, methodical way of serious investigative journalism. A long-form piece in a major outlet, drawing on Elena's notebooks, Sandra's documents, and years of Carla's reporting. The FBI received over 300 requests from members of Congress, child welfare organizations, and victims' advocacy groups to reopen the case. They reopened it. Elena heard the news from Carla, who called her at 7 o'clock on a Thursday morning. "They are reopening it," Carla said. Elena sat down on the kitchen floor, not because she was weak, but because her legs simply couldn't hold the weight of 21 years releasing all at once. She sat there for a long time, her back against the cabinet, looking at the hallway that led to Mia's bedroom. The room she kept exactly as it was. The horses on the walls, the library book on the nightstand. But the truth, she was about to learn, was not what anyone expected. What the reopened federal investigation uncovered over the following 18 months was not a single monstrous act committed by a single monstrous person. It was worse than that. In some ways, it was much worse. Because it was a system, a failure so deep and so layered that no single individual could carry the full weight of it, which meant, in a way that still makes Elena angry when she thinks about it, that no single individual ever truly faced full accountability for it. What investigators pieced together, across thousands of hours of interviews and document reviews and forensic work that extended far beyond Callaway Creek, was this. David Crane had not acted alone. He had been connected, loosely but verifiably, to a network of individuals involved in the trafficking of children across state lines. This network had operated for years in rural areas, specifically targeting small communities with limited law enforcement resources and institutional infrastructure that was easy to manipulate. The field trip had been the mechanism. The cancellation of the real booking had been deliberate. The bus route had been prearranged. Roy Hendricks, the driver, had been coerced. Not a willing participant. A man with a debt and a threat hanging over him who had believed, until the very last moment, that the children would only be moved temporarily and would not be harmed. Roy Hendricks had died in 2011, 8 years before the case was reopened. He had taken what he knew to his grave, carrying it for 8 years in a silence that his daughter, who spoke to investigators in 2025, said had destroyed him. He had spent the last years of his life barely speaking, barely eating, barely present. She hadn't understood why until the investigation revealed it. Mrs. Patricia Okafor had not been a participant. She had been as much a victim as her students. She had boarded that bus believing she was taking her class on a field trip. Most of the children, 19 of the 23, were found. Not in Callaway Creek. Not in Texas. They were found, over the course of the investigation, in circumstances that I will describe only generally, out of respect for their privacy and the privacy of their families, but which involved years of exploitation, of being moved across borders, of childhoods that were taken from them in ways that no legal verdict and no institutional apology could ever repair. 4 of the children were not found. Their fates remain, as of this telling, unknown. Mrs. Okafor was found alive in 2025. She was living under a different name in a rural area of Mexico, where she had been held for the first several years and had subsequently been unable, through a combination of trauma, surveillance, and fear, to safely escape or make contact with the outside world. When investigators finally reached her, she had been attempting to work her way toward a safe means of communication for years. She was 63 years old. She had lived with what had happened to her and to those children for 21 years. Several members of the network were prosecuted federally. David Crane was located, living under a different name in a small town in rural Georgia. He was extradited, tried, and convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy, trafficking, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Others received sentences ranging from 15 years to life. Some individuals connected to the case, people who had known pieces of it and chosen silence, faced charges of obstruction. Cheryl Baxter, the after-school coordinator who had contradicted her own statement, was one of them. She had not been a participant in the planning, but she had seen something that morning, something that had frightened her into saying nothing. She had lived with that choice for 21 years. She pleaded guilty and cooperated fully with investigators. She was sentenced to 4 years. And through all of it, through every press conference and trial date and victim testimony and sentencing hearing, Elena Vasquez was there, with her notebooks, her maps, her photographs, and the knowledge that she had been right. Mia Vasquez was reunited with her mother on a Tuesday afternoon in August 2025. She was 31 years old. She had dark curly hair, still, after everything, still curly, and she walked into Elena's house with the careful, cautious movements of a person learning to trust a space before they fully enter it. Elena had been told to let Mia lead, to not rush, to be patient and present, and to not expect the reunion to look like anything in particular. She had tried very hard to prepare herself for that moment. She had not come close to succeeding. When Mia walked through the door and stopped in the hallway and looked around at the house where she had grown up, the house that had been exactly as she left it, in ways that mattered, in ways that had changed naturally with time, she was very still for a long moment. And then she looked at her mother. Elena did not speak. She had planned to speak. She had planned to say something. Something worthy of 21 years of waiting. Something that captured the love and the grief and the relief and the fury and the gratitude and the sorrow that had lived in her chest every single day since October 14th, 2003. But all she could do was open her arms. And Mia, who had spent 21 years in a world that had tried very hard to take everything from her, walked into them. In the months that followed, Elena began the slow and careful work of learning who her daughter had become. Mia was in therapy. Several of the reunited children were in therapy. There are organizations, quiet, serious, underfunded organizations, that specialize in this particular kind of reintegration. And they were involved, and they were helping, and it was hard, and it would continue to be hard for a long time. Elena was asked by several journalists, in the aftermath of the case, why she had never stopped. She always said the same thing. She said, "I stopped when Mia asked me to." Meaning, she would have stopped if her daughter had wanted her to. If Mia had somehow communicated that she wanted to be left in peace. If the search had been causing harm to the people she was searching for, she would have found a way to let go. But no one had asked her to stop. And so she hadn't. What strikes me most about Elena Vasquez, and I think about this often, is not the obsession. It's not the wall of maps or the notebooks or the 21 years of sleepless nights. What strikes me is the clarity. In a situation that broke most people who touched it, Elena maintained a kind of terrible, patient clarity. She was not confused about what mattered. She was not distracted by what people thought of her. She was not seduced by theories that felt satisfying but weren't true. She kept returning to the evidence, to the facts, to the small and specific things. A folded jacket, a canceled booking, a woman who couldn't remember her own morning. There's a lesson in that. Not a comfortable one. The lesson is that institutions fail. Not because the people inside them are evil. Most of them are not. But because institutions are designed to process what's already known. And some crimes live outside the edges of what's already known. Some crimes depend on invisibility. They depend on the case going cold. They depend on the grieving mother being quietly, gently, persistently encouraged to let go. And when the institution reaches the edge of its capacity, someone has to keep going. In Callaway Creek, that someone was Elena Vasquez. There is a memorial now in the park at the center of town, a simple one, at Elena's request. Not a monument to tragedy, a monument to persistence. It reads, "For those who were taken, and those who never stopped looking." The Hartwell Reserve, ironically, is still open. Children still go there on field trips, still walk the same hiking trails and look at the same exhibits about local wildlife and ecosystems. The staff there sometimes look at the groups of kids moving through the building, laughing, distracted, 10 and 11 years old, and think about what happened. And in a quiet room in the city where she now lives, Mia Vasquez has started drawing horses again. She didn't plan to. She just found herself, one afternoon, picking up a pencil, and her hand remembered what her mind had tried very hard to bury. The shapes came back to her the way Satan kind of knowledge always do. Slowly at first, then all at once, then as if they had never left. She drew a horse. She showed it to her mother. Elena framed it. She hung it in the living room, next to the 3 she had kept there for 21 years. 4 horses on the wall now. 1 for each decade of waiting. 1 for each year that she had refused, in the face of everything, to accept that silence was the same as an answer. She didn't stop looking because she couldn't move on. She stopped because the truth finally came out. What would you have done if everyone told you to let go? Answer in the comment. If this story moved you, share it, because stories like this deserve to be told. and the people inside them deserve to be remembered.